sing song this evening, number 453. Number 453. We'll sing the first and last stanzas, and then we led in closing prayer by Brother Jimmy Bennett. Let's all sing out together. I was sinking deep in sin, from the peaceful shore, very deeply staying within, sinking to rise no more. But the Master of the sea heard my despairing cry. From the waters lifted me, now safe am I. Love lifted me, Lord me, love lifted me, Lord me, when nothing else could help. Love lifted me, love lifted me, Lord me, love lifted me, Lord me, when nothing else could help. Love lifted me. Souls in danger look above, Jesus completely saves. He will lift you by His love out of the angry waves. He's the Master of the sea, builds His will obey. He, your Savior, wants to be saved today. Love lifted me, Lord me, love lifted me, Lord me, when nothing else could help. Love lifted me, love lifted me, Lord me, love lifted me, Lord me, when nothing else could help. Love lifted me.
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day to come together and learn more from your word. Rachel, be with the ones that go to class tonight, that they'll learn and be able to take what they learn to the public and spread your word throughout the world. Rachel, be with the homeless, elderly, sick, hungry, comfort them. Be with the ones that's lost loved ones and comfort them. Watch over the police, military, and first responders. Keep them safe and forgive us all sin. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
This evening. We'll be in 2 Corinthians 6, picking up there about verse 8. 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 8. And I've got a couple of spare worksheets. I don't know if we want to hand these out, if anybody needs those. Okay, I'll leave the stack with you. Thank you, sir. And I've got worksheets for 7 if we happen to get into it, but I'm not sure that we will tonight. We're in chapter 6, beginning in verse 8. And Paul's in the middle of a section that runs from 3 to 10, 2 Corinthians 6, 3, and it runs through verse 10. And we've read that a number of times, so I'm not going to read it again. But we're in the section there, beginning in verse 8, where he starts out this compare and contrast. On the one hand, he says, by glory or honor, your text might say, He says, but on the other hand, we, the apostles, are also dishonored on the other hand. And we talked a little bit about that last week, how there were people who thought highly of Paul and the others, but then there were others who did not think so highly of them. Same thing in verse 8, by evil report and by good report. You could have asked certain people and they would have said, oh yeah, Paul's a great guy. But if you had asked the opponents here at Corinth, they would have said, no, we don't like him much. Then at the end of 6:8, he said, we were regarded as deceivers and yet true. And this is an interesting one. If somebody would get Matthew chapter 27 and verse 63 for us. Matthew chapter 27 and verse 63. I want to show us that some of these things, not accidentally, are quite similar to Jesus Christ. And so if somebody's got Matthew chapter 27 and verse 63, who would like to read for us? Tony, go ahead if you would.
And said, Sir, we remember that when he was still alive, that Caesar said, after 3 days I am to rise again.
Oh, they called him the deceiver. Well, Jesus Christ was no deceiver, but this was the charge leveled against him. They said that Jesus Christ was a liar. They said that his word was dishonest. And so moving back to 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 8, the same kind of thing has been said about Paul, and we've seen this already through the epistle. I'm not going to read a whole lot of these passages, but he's already had to defend his integrity in 2 Corinthians 1:17 through 20, where he says, look, I'm speaking yea, yea, and nay, nay, quite like the Master had said in Matthew chapter 5. He says in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 2, he was transparent, he was open, he was honest. And now in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 8, once again he's saying, we've been regarded by some as deceivers, but yet our word, he says, is true. Paul is a man of integrity. And so moving into verse 9, he says, then as unknown, yet well known. Now if we were drawing all of this out on our contrast, he's saying things that the opponents level against him. So they would have been the ones to say he's a man of dishonor or no glory. Whereas in reality, Paul is saying he does have honor or glory. It's a real glory. It's a different kind of glory than what the opponents might say. So when we get down to this one in chapter 6 and verse 9, and he says, unknown, that's something I'm thinking that the opponents would have said against Paul. They're saying he's unknown. But in reality, Paul says he is well known. Now, I think the contrast is probably this. He's saying when they look at me, I don't have the credentials that they would like for me to have. Somebody might say of him, well, who is this Paul? He's a shrimpy little bald dude, and he doesn't have good-looking teeth. He's the kind of fellow who doesn't have any letters of commendation. And when he does write a letter to us, it comes off badly. He might be something like a hillbilly, somebody might have said. And he's not of the sort. He's just not of the sort. But they're gauging things by a criteria that fits into their worldly, fleshly paradigm. And sometimes we do the same thing even in 2023, where we look at people and we try to make a judgment, even if it were in the right way. We make a judgment in the wrong kinds of ways at times. And what we do is we judge people based on maybe its vocabulary or educational status. And Paul is saying in 2 Corinthians, none of this is gospel. And that's what the opponents are doing. Their entire paradigm, this is all over 2 Corinthians, is to judge Paul based on their own way of thinking rather than the actual criteria of the gospel. And I think what Paul's saying is, these fellows would have regarded me as, well, who is Paul anyway? But he says something like this, we're well known. And it's not by the world. You and I will never be the people that are well known by the world, but will be well known by God. And I think that's the point he's driving at. Folks, look at 2 Timothy 3:12 with me for a brief moment. This is a key passage, I think, in the New Testament that says something about our experience if we are living the faithful Christian life. This is 2 Timothy 3:12. Now, I admit that it comes in different shapes and sizes, but 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 12 is still in the text. Who's got this one for us? 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 12. Eric Watts, if you've got it, go ahead.
Indeed, all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will be persecuted.
Now that's a fact, Paul says. All people who live godly in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. If we make it to the end of our Christian walk, and we said, I don't really remember a time where I was persecuted for my faith, I would challenge it that we might have done something wrong. After all, we live in this world, don't we? Never to once experience any kind of persecution for our faith? Why, at least, shouldn't we be belittled by somebody for our faith? Shouldn't we at least be questioned or challenged? I thought for a moment it might have been my child, but it's not. So we're on safe ground right now. When people persecute Christians, and this doesn't have to be in the most extreme form, does it? But it comes to us in different forms. Maybe they don't like us at work. Maybe they talk about us behind our backs, and we end up hearing the chatter. Maybe it's they make fun of us because we don't use the same kind of language that they use. Maybe they wonder why you give so much of that money that you make. You make that money and you give it to a church. And then they wonder maybe why you're gone every Sunday and Sunday night. Not just once on Sunday, it's twice on Sunday. And then they wonder why maybe you're not there at your house on Wednesday evening at 7 o'clock. And persecution comes to those of us who live godly in Christ Jesus. That's what the text says. So move back to 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 9. When Paul says he's unknown yet well known, the people that follow God will never be the people. You cannot be the people that the world really puts up on a pedestal and reveres, simply because I believe, and I think the text is bringing this out, if we're being the kind of Christians we ought to be, the world won't appreciate us for it. Does that make sense? Now, I think there are ways in which we could be appreciated by the world. Don't misunderstand me. You might be a good...
Brotherly kindness, benevolence, all this.
Excellent. Let's say you're a good business owner, or let's say you're a scientist, or let's say you're a physician, and you make some big discovery. The world may say, hey, that is fantastic, look at this. But when your Christianity steps in, all of a sudden the world's not too fond of that, and never has been. The people who are living godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. And I think that's what Paul's driving at in 6:9. The opponents are wondering why he suffers so much. If he's a real apostle of God, he shouldn't be suffering at all, they're thinking. And Paul says, no, it's because I'm a real apostle of God that, like Jesus, I too suffer. Don't be ashamed if we suffer. What does Peter say in 1 Peter 4:16? If we suffer as a Christian, then let us glorify God on that behalf. But not all suffering is because we're Christians either. Sometimes suffering comes because of sin and transgression, and that's something that Paul's not talking about here. Look at this in 6:9. But he says another contrast, and he says, as dying, yet behold we live. And then he goes on to say, as punished, yet not put to death. I'm going to try to be brief here, but you know I struggle. As dying, yet behold we live, has been a motif that runs all through 2 Corinthians. He said it in chapter 1, verses 8 through 10. He said it in chapter 2, 14 through 16. He said it in chapter 4, 7 through 12. He said it in chapter 5, verses 14 and 15. So when he gets here to chapter 6 and he says, we are regarded as dying, yet behold we live, he's replicating something he's already said in the text a number of times. I'm just going to move off of that. Look at this next line. As punished, yet not put to death. Now, the opponents were regarding him as dying, is what he's saying there in 6:9. And he says, but actually we live. I think he's probably talking about they're looking at this as a weakness, a human weakness. And he's saying they've missed the boat again. Our entire life that they regard as like a death kind of process, he's weak in the human flesh is what they're arguing. He says we're actually living to the fullest. Christians, we may go through certain things, and this is Paul's argument, that the world may look at and say there's a weakness. God's not on his side. Isn't that what Job's friends thought? They saw all the trial and the struggle, and they said, he can't be God's man. And actually, the whole time, God was investing in Job to be his man through the trial and to let gospel shine through the whole episode. So they're making that kind of argument, I think. But then there's this next one. What did he say? We're regarded as punished. But what did he say? But not killed. Regarded as punished, but not killed. This sends me back to that long, tedious discussion we had about the cross and the atonement of Jesus Christ. And the passage that's on my mind is Galatians 3:13. Somebody read that one for us just very quickly. Galatians chapter 3 and verse 13. Who's got it for us and would not mind to read it? Galatians chapter 3 and verse 13. Eric, do you have it? Okay.
Makes a difference. I don't want to read everything.
Oh, well, that's okay. Go ahead. Galatians 3:13, if you've got it, that's perfectly fine.
Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us, for it is written, curses everyone who hangs on the tree.
Now, we've spent a little bit of time in this passage in the last couple of weeks before this. And in Galatians 3:13, he's saying Christ became a curse for us. This is a quotation of Deuteronomy 21:23, as we've looked at. But Deuteronomy 21:23 is a pronouncement upon the wicked, the evildoer, the guilty. And he's saying, Paul is, that is, of Jesus Christ, that if somebody would have walked by the foot of the cross, and they did this if you look at the gospel accounts, they would have looked up at the tree and they would have said, there's a thief, there's a robber, there's a murderer, because of the sentence. Surely this man, if he's dying a death on the cross, he had to be a thug. That's their argument. And Paul's saying he took it on, but he wasn't the sort. Now, this becomes a question then. Christ cannot be punished by God, that is. If he's punished by wicked people. Christ can't be punished by God. It would make a severe injustice of who God is. But I want to raise this question. Could Paul be punished by God? And I think the argument has to be yes. Yes, that's right. First of all, he was a sinner, wasn't he? Could God, what's the purpose of punishment? Think about it as a parent. Why would you ever punish your child? Everybody said correction, I think. Nobody said because we like seeing our children beaten? No, that'd be bad. If one of you said that, we'd need to meet. But
Plus it hurts your hand, too.
yeah, well, there you go. So in that form of punishment, I suppose that's true. Why would Paul have been beaten? Maybe for punished. Maybe for correction? Well, he said as much, didn't he? Go back a few chapters. Look at this in 2 Corinthians 1. These are some of the key texts, I think, if we're taking some of these key passages away from 2 Corinthians. These would be some that are seared into my mind. Not that that's to say that, therefore, these are the ones. But take a look at 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and begin about verse 8, whoever's got it, and run through 10 if you wouldn't mind. Who wants to read for us? 2 Corinthians chapter, Roy, if you've got it. 2 Corinthians 1:8, and if you'll go through verse 10.
For we do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, of our trouble which came to us in Asia, that we were burdened beyond measure, above strength, so that we despaired even of life. Yes, we had the sins of death in ourselves, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead, who delivered us from so great a debt, and does deliver us, in whom we trust that he will still deliver us.
Okay, so Paul says in verse 9, he did have the sentence of death within himself. For what reason? So that we would not trust in ourselves. Do you think that maybe God put these trials in Paul's way, not to try to get Paul to trip up, but to try to move Paul where he needed to be as a human being? Do you think Paul may have ever reached this kind of transformation without such a stumbling block, if we might even word it that way? Maybe not. Maybe not. Tony, go ahead.
Well, the most obvious one to me would be when he was streaking blood on his way to Damascus. I mean, God did that.
Right.
Now, obviously, Paul suffers a lot of things that are done by man, too.
Yeah.
But I mean, he did punish him in a way, took his vision away from him. It was for a purpose.
Yes.
It served a purpose. But what if he had not been obedient? Would it have been able to ever see him?
Don't know. Don't know. Probably, possibly not. Do you think God, if he does that, and he does in Acts 9, Acts 22, Acts 26, do you think that that was God's way of getting Paul's attention? Surely got a hold of him, didn't he? Look at this one. Who's got 2 Corinthians 12:7? It's on the screen if you'd like to read it off there. Who would like to read this one for us? 2 Corinthians 12:7. Adam, if you would, go ahead.
Because of the surprising greatness of the revelations, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself.
Twice he says the thorn in the flesh was to keep him from exalting himself. Now we need to spend some time in 2 Corinthians 12:7 when we get there to talk about the thorn in the flesh. But it sure sounds an awful lot like 2 Corinthians 1:9, where he had just said, we learned we wouldn't trust in ourselves, doesn't it? Whatever's going on in 2 Corinthians chapter 1 might give us a little bit of a compliment as to what's going on in 2 Corinthians 12 with the thorn in the flesh. Once again, he insists that whatever this trial was, it was actually given to him for the purpose of preventing self-exaltation. Now, if you look at 12:8, he said, I implored the Lord 3 times that it might leave me. He said, my grace is sufficient. Who gave Paul the thorn anyway?
That's Satan gave it Paul,
It was a messenger.
It's a messenger of Satan. That's true. God's responsible, isn't he? Could God have taken it away? Yeah, he could have. But God obviously saw some benefit in it too. Maybe God sees some benefit in letting those messengers of Satan in our own lives, whatever they may be, work their number on us, and it might actually turn us into transforming people. You ever worked with people and you feel like you're not getting them to move where you want them to move? Try ministry out sometimes, you know. Be an elder, be a deacon, be a teacher, be a preacher, and try to work on the members and work on your kids and work on your wife, and they don't move. Just to look back 5 years down the road and you look back and you think, God maybe wasn't trying to move everybody else. Maybe he was trying to move me. You know, you've seen the comic where the guy's pushing on this rock, and the comic develops, and he does this for a good number of weeks or months. And by the end of it, he's stronger by the end of it. Rock hasn't moved, but he's become a different person. And I wonder if that's what's happening to Paul. He's trying to move Corinth, and he's so intent on getting Corinth to move, maybe they don't move. But by the end of it, is Paul the same person that he once was? No, Paul's transforming. Maybe God's using the trials and the struggles to change Paul. Now let's move back to the book of Psalms. And I want to show you that punishment, at least from the psalmist's perspective, this is Psalm chapter 6, if you'll glance at this with me. Punishment is not always a bad thing. Now, punishment doesn't feel great at the time, but even Hebrews chapter 12 brings out, Hebrews 12, 5 through 12 brings out that, you know, there are bad fathers that like to punish in the wrong way. And it says, and some fathers even punish with good intentions, but they do it in the wrong way. But then he says in Hebrews chapter 12, but God being the perfect loving Father, he disciplines us because he loves us. Hebrews 12, 5 through 12. Now that's what a good father would do, but look at this. Psalm 6, I'll read some of these. Psalm 6, 1 through 3. For the choir director, he says, with stringed instruments upon an 8-string lyre. This is a psalm of David. Now here's what he says in 6:1. O Lord, this is the psalmist asking God, do not rebuke me in your anger. Do not chasten me in your wrath. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I'm pining away. Heal me, O Lord, for my bones are dismayed. My soul is greatly dismayed. But you, O Lord, how long? Look at this in Psalm chapter 38 with me, if you would. Psalm 38 and verse 1, where he says something quite similar. Psalm 38:1, a psalm of David for a memorial. Lord, rebuke me not in your wrath. Chasten me not in your burning anger. So there would be a kind of chastening that would be for our benefit. And then this is Psalm chapter 119, and I think is it 93? Psalm 119, 93? We'll find out here in a moment if I got it right or not. Nope, that's not the one. Psalm 119:71. Let's drop up a bit. This is Psalm 119:71. David's writing about the power of the Word of God and all of the effect that it takes. And he says this, it is good for me that I was afflicted, that I may learn your statutes. Now, before I go to a passage in the Proverbs, let me ask this. I wonder sometimes, what statutes of God have I not yet learned that I might need to learn? And in order for me to learn them, God's going to have to correct me. Now, here's the idea, and this is where it kicks in, I think, with some wisdom and some foresight. What if we were proactive enough to try to learn whatever precepts of God He's trying to teach us? What if we tried to work on learning those things before God ever has to correct us to learn them? Does that make sense? If God says, now, Drew, if you don't learn this in 5 years, I'm going to correct you to the point that I'll make you learn it. What if we try to go ahead and learn whatever it might be that we're lacking in our life so that God doesn't have to correct us?
Maybe Paul wrote it as a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, meaning you're working, you're trying to stay ahead of the curve.
Yeah, that's right.
Maybe that's why he used the word workman that needeth not to
Yeah. See, Paul's learning about self-humility, right? So says 2 Corinthians chapter 1, 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And how's he learning it? Through punishment. But I wonder if we can avoid the punishment and try to learn whatever it is God's wanting us to learn without that. Take a look at one more passage before we move back to 2 Corinthians 6. This is Proverbs chapter 3, 11 and 12. Look at this in Proverbs chapter 3, beginning in 11 and going through 12. And who's got this one and wants to read it for us? Proverbs 3, 11 and 12. Caleb's got it. Caleb, whenever you're good. Proverbs 3, 11 and 12.
My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor detest his correction. For whom the Lord loves, he corrects, just as a father the son to whom he delights.
Now that's the passage that Hebrews chapter 12, 5 through 12 makes use of. Hebrews chapter 12, 5 through 12 uses this text to say God loves the people that he does correct. He's trying to bring us, he's trying to transform us where we need to be. But if we think about Paul then, do you think that he was punished? We could argue that case. But in the context, maybe he's also arguing, I am perceived by the opponents that God's punishing me, but the whole time I'm not actually being punished, he says. Maybe I'm suffering quite like the master, and I'm not being killed. I'm actually living for other people. Let's move back to 2 Corinthians chapter 6. Any comments or questions on that before we look at 6 and verse 10? Okay, so if this is tough to bear, I think. You find out this week you've got cancer. You find out this week you've got a tumor. Don't just go ahead and look at it as senseless and useless. Use it at least as a springboard to maybe generate thoughts that God would have us generate. Does that make sense? What else can we see from the fall and the chaos that's in our world? I think there's a good number of things that God's trying to teach us. And sometimes the suffering and the punishment is not just to be dismissed as some heinous crime. Maybe God's actually trying to get us to wake up in some ways. Some ways that maybe we would have never been brought back to our senses. I'm getting personal now. I'm going to tell you one thing and I'm going to move off of it. We've got a cousin. You've met him, I think, some of you, good number of you. Got married back in December. Lots of money. Spouse is going to have lots of money. Things were going to go great. Nobody could have predicted what had happened. We were sitting at lunch last month, maybe the start of this month, and the question was asked, how's the married man doing? And married 4 months, and we're getting a divorce. Ooh, you talk about a killer. Woo. But I'm afraid of this. I'm thinking that maybe it would have never been the case, and this still hasn't happened yet, I'm telling you. But I'm thinking maybe this would have never been the case that this cousin of mine would have ever even given God his full, devoted attention. Why? Well, I think that maybe the attitude was, I'm a self-made man, I can do it all on my own. And now I wonder if in 30 years from now, this cousin of mine might look back at this time in history and be an individual who loves God and serves God and wish radically that he could have done things differently, if he could do things over again. And I wonder if, though, in 30 years, he might look back and say, but without that radical moment in history, I would never be who I am today. And I wonder if we, too, are missing maybe some opportunities in ways where we could grow and be benefited without having the punishment or the chastisement. But if it does take that, I wonder if in years, 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20, 30, 50 years, we might look back and say, you know, I hated that moment in my life, but I wouldn't be who I am today without it. And maybe God's trying to shake us and wake us up before the punishment or the chastisement gets too severe. So enough of the personal story. Let's look at 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 10. He says, as sorrowful, maybe they did look at him as this fellow who's always down in the dumps, but somehow Paul, the sufferer, the one who appeared to be punished by God, was always, he says in 6:10, rejoicing. And then he gives us this other one. He says, as poor, yet making many rich. So here's another one to add to the list. They looked at Paul as a poor fellow, but he says in actuality, he says, we're full of riches. Now you can think of too many passages in the New Testament for us to take the time to read where he talks about spiritual riches, Luke 16, Matthew 6, and a number of other passages. We all know that the physical things don't amount to a hill of beans when it's all said and done. And if we don't know that, we need to figure it out before it's too late. But Luke 12:15 still does say, don't don't be deceived, a man's life doesn't consist in the things that he possesses. But in an interesting way, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 3:21 through 23, saints possess all things. I wonder what he's talking about. He's talking about we've got a reality beyond this world that matters far more than whatever this world has to offer. And if you look across the page at 2 Corinthians 8:9, somebody's going to read this one for us. This is the way that Jesus Christ himself lived, and this is the template that our Apostle Paul seeks to follow. And this is the template that we too should seek to follow. Who's got 2 Corinthians 8 and verse 9 for us? Somebody's got it in the paper text. I clicked the wrong button. Caleb, go ahead. 2 Corinthians 8:9.
For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, that you through his poverty might become rich.
Okay, so I've got bad problems with the fingers right now. 2 Corinthians 8:9. Jesus Christ took on poverty so that we might become, what did he say? Rich. He took on poverty as the world would look at it so that we might be made rich. If you and I were out there in a distant planet and we decided we were going to come to Earth, I don't think I would have wanted to come and work construction. That's what Jesus Christ, the Son of God who came to this planet, did. I wonder why he did that. I would have rather come as a CEO. After all, I don't want a construction job. That's tough labor, isn't it? I think I would have come as somebody that's set up nice with a good trust fund or something like that. But Jesus Christ doesn't come that way. He comes at a moment of history where the Romans are cruel. He knows the cross is coming, so says John 18:1 through 4. And he comes in that period of history and decides of all things to be, I think I'll be a carpenter's boy. And I'll be a carpenter myself, Mark 6:3 says again. Now that's interesting to me, because in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 10, he says, Paul does of himself, he was poor, but making many rich. And I wonder if people aren't looking at us today thinking that we're the scum of the world, as 1 Corinthians 4:10 through 13 says. But in reality, if we're doing the things that pertain to the gospel, we're seeking to make other people rich. Rich in the realest way. This is our last little bit there in verse 10. As having nothing, and here you have the line, but possessing all things. Too many passages to go to here. Just remember, folks, that if we really are committed to the cross and committed to Christianity, we've got it all. We have absolutely got it all. Where do you expect to be in 100 years? That's what I thought. All of us are going to be on the same playing field. I'd make the gamble not a one of us here will be alive, right? In 100 years, some of you might get real lucky. Seth's banking on it, so we'll talk to him afterwards. I don't think so, Seth. I hate to be the spoiler, but no, I don't think so. In 100 years, we're probably all going to be in the dirt. But we'll not all be really in the dirt, will we? We're going to be somewhere else. I like what Tom Warren said, and he had it right. He said, everybody's going to be somewhere for eternity. Where are we going to be? In 100 years, what's going to matter? Now, here's the thing. This whole list that we've looked at, all the way from 6:3 all the way through verse 10, where he talks about, I'm not going to offend the ministry. My whole life is saturated with suffering, and he gives us something like 27 or 28 different items that just look horrible. Who would want the life, as he talked about in 6 and verse 5, beatings, imprisonments, labors, hunger? Who wants that kind of life? What do you think the opponents thought of Paul at this point? Don't you think they would have looked at Paul's life and they would have said, he can't be apostolic. He can't be God's man. His life is too wrecked for that to be the case. But that is precisely what Paul's argument is. It's because I am this way. It's because of the weaknesses I do have. And it's because of the suffering that it is all around my life that I reflect that of the risen Lord. Folks, don't try to dismiss the suffering out of your life just to get rid of the suffering. Christ told us it was going to be here if we're living faithfully. Try to gain a new perspective as how to see the perspective of suffering as being that of the Christian. And think about it this way. It is the most that we are like the Master who hung on the tree for our behalf. Corinth loved the resurrection. They loved this idea of a boy raising back from the dead. What they couldn't stomach was this idea of the boy going to death in the first place. It was foolishness to the world, he said in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. And Paul's saying it's that foolishness that we need to seek to emulate in our own lives as well. The world looks at it as stupid. But he said this is the way we emulate Christ and show what real divine power looks like in a human body. You want to look like divine power in a body? Suffer for the cause of Christ and we'll have it down. We'll look like Christ. And maybe one of the angels will look at us at a distance and say, oh, he looks just like him. Eric, you've got a point.
I think you actually touched on it a little bit, but I'm still fascinated when you think about the opposers and the opponents of thinking that the detriment and thorn in the flesh and all those things with Paul was a bad thing in relation to Christ. Because when I think of my Lord, I think of him as a man who suffered while he was here on this earth. I mean, he was in a manger, you know. I mean, he wasn't even in a legitimate room per se.
Yeah.
When he was born, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And when you think about it from that perspective, how they can still look at Christ, but as I said, you just mentioned it about his power and resurrection and all those great things, but they failed to realize what he was when he was here as a human being.
Yeah, yeah.
A fellow human being. And it still just baffles me that they would give Paul such a hard time when, I mean, foxes have holes.
Yeah, right.
Know?
Yeah.
Christ didn't even have a home, you know? I mean, it's just,
yeah,
it's
and
interesting.
see, I think they did the same thing in Moses too. There's an obvious appeal to Moses in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and in chapter 11. And I think if we read it correctly, here's what they were saying. They were saying, well, Moses was that guy who split the sea. Isn't that cool? And he worked the 10 plagues, and he had the staff and the stones and all of this. And Paul's saying, but you're neglecting the fact that the people didn't like Moses in his own day. They were the ones who wanted to get him out of his position of power, more or less. Miriam and Aaron, his own brethren, were saying this sort of thing. Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, Numbers chapter 16, something that he'll allude to here in the chapter. And he's saying they wanted to look at Moses as just this wonder worker, not realizing that Moses too was a righteous sufferer just like Jesus in some ways. And that's what Paul's seeking to emulate. So maybe if we get the right perspective on Moses and Jesus, we'll get the right perspective on who we as Christians need to be too. It's not about a luxurious system of pride and honor and glory. It's about something else. It's about real power, real honor, and real glory, and what that might look like if we emulate Jesus Christ's pattern as he did on the cross. Take a look at this in 6:11 then. 6:11 through 13. Let's read it together. Somebody's got it that one's going to read it for us. 2 Corinthians 6:11 through 13. Who's got it? Eric, if you would. 2 Corinthians 6:11 through verse 13.
2 Corinthians 12, verse 3.
And while he's reading, if you can memorize those three passages, 11, 12, and 13, that'd be really good for the point I'm about to make. 6, 11, 12, and 13.
Our mouth has spoken freely to you, O Corinthians. Our heart is open wide. You are not restrained by us, but you are restrained in your own affections. Now in like exchange, I speak as to children, open wide to us also. Okay,
give it a second glance. Get the big ideas in your mind for just a second out of 6, 11 through 13. Mouth is speaking openly. Heart is open wide. Verse 12 says he's calling on them. Don't hold back in your love for us. And then in verse 13 again, he says, open wide your hearts. You know, I'm speaking to you as in an intimate relationship, like children, like if you were my children. Open wide to us. Love us the same way that we've loved you. Okay, now, Eric, if you'll read 7, flip over to chapter 7, and read 2 through 4 for us, if you will.
Make room for us in your hearts. We wronged no one. We corrupted no one. We took advantage of no one. I do not speak to condemn you, for I have said before you that you are in our hearts to die together and to live together. Great is my confidence in you. Great is my boasting on your behalf. I am filled with comfort. I am overflowing with joy in all our affliction. Okay, now the point I'm making is a touch technical, but try to follow it. 7, 2 through 4. How many of you, just glance over it again, think it sounds an awful lot like 6, 11 through 13? Oh, it's almost identical, isn't it? I mean, he's calling for the same thing that he's just called for in 6, 11 through 13. 7, 5 through 7, I'll make this point when we get there, so don't worry about it now. But 6, 5 through 7 does the exact same thing with 2, 12, and 13. So we'd have to go all the way back to chapter 2 to see it. The point I'm making is this. This is not accidental. This is the way. They don't have chapter divisions in the text, you see. And what Paul is doing is he's intentionally structuring it this way so that it has divisions, like brackets and units. And the point I'm seeking to make is that 6, 11 through 13 and 7, 2 through 4 clearly marks out this unit in the in-between, which is 6, 14 through 7, 1.
That is important. That is perhaps the climax of the entire 2 Corinthians text. This is where Paul really calls for it. What has Paul been calling for? Reconciliation. He's been telling Corinth the whole way through the letter up to this point, you need to come back home. These opponents have duped you. You've gone astray. You don't understand real apostolic authority. You don't understand real Christianity. And he's been calling on them now for 6 chapters to get it right. He's given them the criteria. And now in 6:11, he goes ahead and he asks them to just be open with their heart. So he says in 6:11, look at it with me, our mouth has spoken freely to you. He's not hiding his speech. He's being very open. And then he uses, O Corinthians, something he only ever does twice in the New Testament. He says, O Philippians, and he says, O Galatians. But it is rare for Paul to speak so personally and call the church by name. He does it 3 times. This is one of the 3. And then in verse 11, he says, our heart is opened wide. Verse 12, you're not restrained by us. That is, we're not holding back. Have you ever loved where you've given your entire self for somebody else? Well, that's how Christ did. And he says, and we're doing you guys the same way. Corinth is not at a loss for Paul's love for them. It's actually because he does love them that he's saying some really tough things. And then in 6:12 he says, but you are restrained in your own affections. Corinth hasn't returned the favor. They're not in love with Paul like Paul is in love with them. And that's a real sour thing when the preacher's not loved by the brethren or the brethren aren't loved by the preacher. That's not a good mix. That doesn't go. Paul's needing Corinth to come back around and to see him for who he is and to see God for who he is and love not only Paul, but love God through Paul. And he says in 6:13, now in a like exchange, he brings in the intimate kind of relationship, I speak as to children, open wide to us also. Now here's the point. He has been building to what he's about to say in 6:14. And before we get into 6:14, let me try to give us just a quick summary of what we've been dealing with up to that point. And that is this. Who is Paul fighting against up to this point in 2 Corinthians? He's been at somebody. It's not just been Corinth. He's trying to pull Corinth back. But who are the people that are fighting against him? We'll just call them the interlopers, the opponents, the antagonists, the opposers. We don't have a good name to slap on them. Maybe we should just term them this for sake of giving them a name, and that is the Judaizers. These are the people at Corinth who have been saying all of what they've been saying, and Paul's been saying, I don't agree with any of that. And they've been saying it all the way up to 6. Now here's the point I seek to make. If we've done a good job at establishing the context, look at a few passages with me, a few key passages. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse, 17? 2 Corinthians 2:17 says this, if you're with me. 2:17, we are not like many. I wonder who are the many. Look at 3:1. In 3:1 he says, but are we beginning to commend ourselves again, or do we need as some? Who are the some? And then we get to chapter 5 and verse 12. And this is the clearest up to the point that we've gotten in the book so far. He's going to get real clear in chapters 10, 11, 12, and 13. But in chapter 5 and verse 12, he says, we are not again commending ourselves to you, but are giving you an occasion to be proud of us, so that you will have an answer for those who take pride in appearance and not in heart. Who are those who take pride in appearance but not in heart? Paul is up against somebody. And I'm suggesting that when we get to 6:14, he is not leaving the context behind. When we get to chapter 6 and verse 14, and he speaks of this group, the unbelievers, he's speaking of the same group that he's been speaking of the entire way through. The unbelievers, contrary to a good number of folks, I know what the big hitters say. The big hitters want us to say that these are non-Christians. That just won't go, in my opinion. In the context, he's against the same people he's been at odds with the entire way through. The unbelievers are his Christian opponents who are trying to lead Corinth away to, what does he call it in 2 Corinthians 11? A false gospel. Look at this in 2 Corinthians 11 with me, and then I'll try to make this kind of hit home and you'll see where I'm headed. Look at this in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and let's do verse 4 first. Who's got 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 4? Logan, if you've got it, go ahead. 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 4.
For if one comes and preaches another Jesus, whom we have not preached, or you receive a different spirit which you have not received, or a different gospel which you have not accepted, you bear this beautifully.
2 Corinthians 10 through 13, the chapters 10, 11, 12, and 13 are extremely clear. This is where he just comes out and lets loose, and he has a go at the opposers. But in 2 Corinthians 11:4, he makes it clear that these opponents that he has at Corinth that are trying to lead Corinth astray are those who preach, what does he say? 3 things. Another Jesus, another spirit, and another gospel. He says that of Christian opponents. They thought that Jesus was the Messiah, but they had the wrong idea about him. Drop down to 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 13. Look at this one, and I'll just read this one. 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 13. Speaking of his opponents, later on in the text, he says this: such men, his opponents at Corinth, are false apostles, deceitful workers, and they disguise themselves as apostles of Christ. No wonder, he says, even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. And then he says in 15, therefore it's not surprising if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness, whose end will be according to their deeds. What's the point? The people he's addressing here in 2 Corinthians are Christians, quote unquote. They go to the church of Christ at Corinth. But their view of gospel is off bad. Now let's move back to 2 Corinthians 6:14 then. And in 2 Corinthians 6:14, when he says that one should not be yoked or bound together, he says don't be unequally yoked or don't be bound together with unbelievers. If we have followed the context rightly this far through this point, he's not talking about marriage. There's nothing in the context that would suggest marriage is in view. What he's talking about is that Corinth should not be linked up with the opponents who are teaching a false gospel. So this passage has been abused in a good number of ways over the years to say, well, it refers to Christians going into business with non-Christians. No, that's not in the context. That's not in view. People have said, well, the unequal yoke refers to a Christian marrying a non-Christian. No, that's not true either. In 2 Corinthians 6, he's still speaking about the opponent, and he's telling Corinth, who he's making these appeals for reconciliation to, don't be bound together with unbelievers, speaking specifically, I'm sure, about the opponents who are leading them into a false gospel. Let's come back on that for just a moment. Let's remind ourselves of a number of things. If you've got the worksheet, this would be a good little section to fill out. Paul's remarks were number 1, or A, in the middle of his apostolic defense. This is the actual context. So let me make the point just once more. I'm beating a dead horse to just a bit here. But this is 2 Corinthians 2. We've been at this for some time now, and I don't know if you've realized I've tried to overload this. You have realized it. You've been like bored with me, I think. But this is 2 Corinthians. I'm not being insulting. I'm insulting myself. 2 Corinthians 2:14 up through 7:4. The whole unit is a defense of his apostolic authority. When we find ourselves in the middle of this in 6:14, he's not off talking about marriage out of the context, you see. He's still very much in line with his argumentation. This is the defense of his apostolic authority. So let's move into point B. This has nothing to do with marriage. It's just not in the context. You don't see a single thing about marriage in the context. When people interject and say, well, a Christian can't marry a non-Christian, this just isn't what the chapter is saying. I'm sorry, it's just not there.
Thank God that's not actually true.
That's true in a number of ways. We'll talk about that when we get to the end. Let me kind of give the argumentation here, and then we'll come back for more practical application. Look at this. Number 1, no mention of it in the context. Number 2, the Old Testament spoke against a marriage to foreigners and not unbelievers. That is absolutely critical. Let me ask you about this relationship. Ahab wants to marry old Jezebel. Scriptural or not? It is. It is scriptural. They're both Israeli, aren't they? Now, if Jezebel had been some foreigner, not of an Israeli sort, and that's an interesting story, by the way. Should have used a different one, probably, in some ways. But if they're both Israeli, he says it's fine. They weren't to marry the foreigners, right? Weren't to marry the foreigners. So when you have a relationship like here's, let's go with another one. Boaz marries Ruth. Is that a scriptural one in the Old Testament? That's a tricky one, isn't it? Ruth is a Moabitess, so she's a foreigner. And because they get married, I'm reading a bit into the text, I know that, so you could push me on this and I might have to give. But Ruth, it looks like to me, may be proselytized. After all, her speech in Ruth 1:16 and 17, my God will be your God will be my God. Wherever you go, I'm going with you. Looks like to me she incorporates into the nation, becomes a proselyte, and then therefore if she is a proselyte, it becomes a scriptural marriage. She's no longer regarded as a legal foreigner. So that could be the case. I think that's probably good. Point 3, the Old Testament separation principle. I always find this one interesting. People want to go back to the Old Testament. The Old Testament, Deuteronomy 7, 1 through 4 said they couldn't marry outside of the nation. True. What I'm also told, though, in Exodus chapter 34, 11 through 16, is that they couldn't do business contracts with them either. Ooh, I wonder why today we hear people going back to the Old Testament to say they weren't to marry the people outside of the people, but we don't hear them saying we can't do business with them. I think a little bit of this might start to hurt, you see. If we start to say we can't do business with those outside of the people of God, how many of us are going to be hurting this week? I've not heard a person make that argument yet, but if we take Exodus 34, the same text that says about marriage, to talk about the business dealings, we've got a real problem. Then there's this, number 4, Paul doesn't contradict himself. Hold yourself, oh, we got to finish. You're not going to kill me here. Look at this in 1 Corinthians 7. Somebody's got it real quick. 1 Corinthians 7, 12 through 14. We've got to move. We've got to move. This is 1 Corinthians 7. Who's got it? Whoever's got it first. You're the quickest. Caleb. 1 Corinthians 7. Listen to 12 through 14.
But to the rest I, the Lord, say, if any brother has a wife who does not believe that she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. And a woman who has a husband who does not believe he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise, your children will be unclean.
Thank you. In 1 Corinthians 7, 12 through 14, twice, in verse 13 and 12, Paul says twice, do not get a divorce if you're a Christian married to a non-Christian. In 2 Corinthians 6:17, if marriage is in view, he says explicitly in 6:17, let them separate. Come out and be separate. Marriage cannot be in view. We need to embellish that a little bit more. We'll do that next week. Thanks for being here. God bless you. Have a good rest of the week, and let's let God be glorified. Thanks for being here. God bless you all.